Okay, it's a big day. We are ranking all of my 2022 reads. I read 57 books this year. I'm gonna try to wrap these up as fast as I can because I don't want this video to be an hour long. But I am cozy in my bed in my cozy sweater with my coffee. So we're just gonna have a cozy, oh my god, I just spilled. Not on my new bedding too, holy. Okay, time out from the coffee. So I'm gonna be ranking the books like worst to best basically, but hold that structure very loosely. I'm basically gonna rank them like lower tier to upper tier. I'm starting with my like 2.5 books, 3.5 going up from there. So the structure within those tiers is kind of loose, just whatever I was feeling. And especially when I'm mixing nonfiction and fiction, it feels really hard to like rate them on the same scale, you know? So hold it loosely, but we're kind of going worst to best. Also, I just don't typically read books I hate. So a lot of these are gonna be like good books that maybe just like weren't perfect for me because I'm rating on vibes. And so if I enjoyed something, it's gonna get a decent rating. If I didn't, it's gonna get a lower rating, even if they're like relatively good books. Before we jump into the ratings, I thought I would share my like STORYGRAPH like stats. So my top moods for my reads were emotional, adventurous, reflective, and dark. I like a long book. 75% of my reads, or wait, 79% of my reads were over 300 pages. 20% were 500 pages and up. Love a long book. I read 75% fiction and 25% nonfiction, which is down from last year. Last year, I think I read like 36% nonfiction, so that went down. My top genres were fantasy, romance, contemporary, LGBTQIA+. For format, I read 54% of my books digitally, 32% print, 14% audio. Audio went up this year. I don't typically do audiobooks very much. Digitally, I read, I don't even have my Kobo here. I read on a Kobo. For me in Canada, Kobo syncs up with Libby/Overdrive. So I rent ebooks from my library and it syncs with my Kobo. Kind of the most interesting stats, my average rating was also 3.91. I'm not gonna have a ton of time to break down every book because there's 57 books, but if you follow me on STORYGRAPH or GOODREADS, I'll put it up below. Definitely prefer STORYGRAPH. There you'll be able to like go through my whole list of reads, click on them, see synopses, and STORYGRAPH is great because it also has a list of trigger warnings. One last thing before I get into it, some of these books are published by HarperCollins and the HarperCollins Union is currently on strike. So definitely like look into that strike before buying any HarperCollins books. I think that covers it. So this lighting is just like really working for me right now. Okay, it is currently also 2:30. I'm really scared I'm gonna lose the light very soon. I gotta power through these. Okay, so let's start at my 2.5 tier. These are my least favorite books I read this year. There are 4 of them. So at the very bottom of the list, I have put Miss Sarah J. Maas' Tower of Dawn. I think I read 5 out of the 8 Throne of Glass series this year, so they're all on the list. If you don't know about the Throne of Glass series, I think it's a YA, like fantasy romance fiction. I think it's YA. In general, I would say it is a good YA fantasy romance. There's a lot of like mixed feelings on Sarah J. Maas, which I understand. But yeah, so Tower of Dawn, it was literally just from the perspective of the one character I disliked the most. I feel like we just could have skipped the book. There was almost nothing important that happened. Honestly, like ranking things and having things like at the bottom of the list just like makes me feel bad. I don't like not liking things and I don't like rating things low. So next on the list I have A Deal with the Elf King. Is it good? No. Is it like particularly well written? Nope. Is it a really easy romance fantasy read to read before bed? Yeah. Basically, like, this human is forced to marry the Elf King to like unite their nations and save their kingdoms. So it's got some like very classic tropes like forced marriage and like enemies to lovers, which I'm using very loosely. It is like easy reading, especially like I like to have a kind of easy read to read before bed. Okay, so next on the list is A Torch Against the Night. Which is the sequel to An Ember in the Ashes, and it was just like a really disappointing sequel to me. This is also like a fantasy romance series. Basically the plot was really slow and there was almost no character development, and like the romance that was trying to be built in it, I just like felt zero investment in. I'm not gonna keep on reading this series. I did like the first book, I read that in 2021, but the sequel just like didn't work for me. And then the last book on my 2.5 category is Bookish People by Susan Cole. This is one of those books that just like jumps between multiple characters' perspective in a specific environment leading up to a specific event, but like nothing really happens and nothing really is all that developed. Like all of the characters kind of annoyed me, all of their perspectives annoyed me, didn't really care for it. I don't know. We have reached my 3 tier. These are books that I feel relatively mediocre about. So they're like fine books, but not necessarily my favorite, but they might be something that you'll like. First up, we have My Year of Rest and Relaxation. This one has been a very popular one, it seems like, on Book Talk, and it's just like really wasn't for me. I will admit the writing was really good, but the premise, basically like the main character self-medicates to try and sleep basically for a year, like cure her mental health. The main character is not very likable, and especially because this character is like rich and white, it just didn't work for me. I know that many other people have really loved it, so. Okay, we also have The Midnight Library. Like, it was fine. I really thought I was gonna love this book, which is why I bought it. The premise sounded exactly like something I would be obsessed with, this kind of like experiencing your multiverse of lives. I feel like it just never really went like deep enough into it for me, and I wish it had gone a little bit deeper. Literally gonna have to go so much faster than I have been. Next up, we have The Assassin's Blade, which is also part of the Throne of Glass series. Basically, it's a bunch of like prequel stories from before the series started, but they feel very irrelevant when you're reading them. You're like, okay, I don't care about any of this shit. I think what I wish is that these stories, experiences had been littered into the series as like flashbacks instead of like taking up a whole book of them, because I was like, okay. Okay, The Neapolitan Sisters is next. This is one of the books I read on audiobook that I probably would have liked more if I read it like in a physical book. Basically, it's like 3 sisters as they lead up to the one sister's wedding. The book was fine and kind of interesting, and it was like kind of fun until the very end. And at the very end, each sister, like with 5% of the book left, like in their last chapter, each sister drops like a bomb about like a secret that they've been keeping from us, the reader. I understand that unreliable narrator is like a thing people enjoy, and I do sometimes as well, like especially in mystery thrillers. Fun. In this one, it just felt so out of place, and then there was no time to resolve any of it because it was like happening in their last chapter. And then there was a bunch of fat phobia. Wasn't a fan. Loving What Is. This is a nonfiction read, kind of going through Byron Katie's framework of asking these questions to kind of work through things emotionally. I liked some of these ideas. It's not something I'm gonna like typically recommend to people because it really isn't for everybody. And the book was really repetitive. It just like went through so many examples of talking through these questions with people. And I just like didn't love a lot of the examples in the book. Next we have Tripping Arcadia. I can't remember reading this book. I have no idea what it's about. What did I say on Instagram when I read it? Oh, okay, it's coming back to me. It's a gothic thriller, kind of like a Great Gatsby vibe. The main character, Lena, gets hired to work for a rich family as their physician's assistant, and she comes to hate the family and seeks out revenge for wrongs done. I like the concept and vibe, but the main character was annoying and like unrealistically vengeful. This is a spoiler alert, but she becomes like homicidal 30% into the book. Oh, sorry, I'm literally getting called right now. And then the book just like drags on really long after that. The ending is outrageously confusing. Next I read Everybody's Son. I read this via audiobook, which definitely is gonna skew my perspective a little bit. I remember the narrator feeling like pretty monotone. This book chronicles like a boy getting adopted by a powerful white political family when his mom goes to prison. It shows big problems within the adoption and foster systems and just the problems with the prison system. I like how those things were displayed. It was like a fine book, but not always the most captivating. Next we have Portrait of a Thief. The concept of this one is basically like a group of college students come together to steal back stolen art, like art that was stolen via colonization and is like on display in largely European museums. It was kind of like heisty. The character and plot felt kind of underdeveloped, so it underwhelmed me. If we were villains, this was a very big book talk book, and I was like overall disappointed, I would say. The writing was really good. The mystery and like darkness of it was really fun too, but I didn't like the ending and I wasn't a fan of the queer representation. So yeah, well written, easy to read, but a couple things that really let me down. Next we have People We Meet on Vacation, which is an which was my second Emily Henry read. I read Beach Read as well this year. It's higher up in the list. It was just a disappointing follow-up to reading Beach Read. It's like an easy reading romance, but because the book starts from this like fractured friendship, didn't have like the fun banter and like tension that Beach Read had. I've heard Book Lovers is very good. I intend to read that one this year. Next I have The Fortunes of Jaded Women, which was also an audiobook read. I don't get as good of a feel for a book via audio generally, I don't think. Is a family of Vietnamese women who like have this curse on them where the men in their lives leave them and they can't have boy children. It's just like kind of chronicles a bunch of the different women in this family and how they like come back together and resolve their issues and like heal the curse. There were like too many characters I think to keep track of, which kind of detracted from it. And it was just like overall I would say a fine read. Okay, next we have The Kiss Curse, which is my last book on my level 3, which is the second book to the X-Hex. So let's just talk about them together. It's like a witchy romance. It's fun. The second one is definitely not as good as the first. It just felt like aggressively cheesier, but maybe that's because I listened to it instead of reading it. Witchy and romance and cute and fun. And for that vibe, it does a fine job. Okay, we're on the 3.5 level now. So next we have House of Sky and Breath, which is part 2 in the Crescent City series. I loved book 1 of the Crescent City series. This is like a fantasy romance kind of genre. The second book was okay. The first 75% meh. The last 25% was really good, and the ending, my jaw was on the ground at that ending, and I am excited for the third book, even though the second one felt kind of mediocre for the most part. Next up is The Journey of Humanity. Can't remember what I thought about it. It is a non-fiction book exploring how humans started developing wealth and the origins of inequality. At times it was really engaging, and at times it felt like a textbook because it focused so much of the history of the way that wealth has been built up. It didn't really discuss like how these origins of wealth and inequality affect individuals today. That was what I really missed out of that book. Otherwise, it was really interesting. It kind of like tackles a more broad overview of inequality between nations, and not really like on an individual level. Oh, my B-reel went off. Next, I listened to Carrie Soto is Back. Basically, it's about this tennis player, Carrie Soto, who retired from tennis and is like making a comeback a decade later. It felt long. I didn't really feel like I was rooting for her. I don't know, it was fine. Next we have A Marvelous Light, which I have mixed feelings about. So it's like a pretty slow burn, like magical realism, history, fantasy book with gay leads. The magic system was really interesting. I wish it was a little bit faster paced, and I wish that the characters were easier to care about. I didn't really feel very invested. I really liked the plot in this one. I enjoyed the experience of reading a lot of it. The romance in it felt mostly sexual and not very romantic. There was definitely some good spice though. Okay, next on my list is City of Brass. I read this in August. It is a series and I have not read book 2. So I guess I'm not as invested in it as I thought I would be. It is like a really interesting and complex fantasy set in the Middle East. The world building is really complex, really interesting. It really took me a while to wrap my head around it. And the characters were a little bit frustrating, but it felt like almost intentional in order to pave the way for some really good development in book 2. I haven't read book 2 yet. I don't actually even know if I will. There are so many other things I want to read that I don't feel that invested in this one anymore. Okay, we are moving on to my 4-star reads. Next, I have Queen of Shadows, Empire of Storms, Kingdom of Ash, and Heir of Fire, all from the Throne of Glass series. These were probably my favorite books in this series, and I enjoyed them. Okay, next up we have the Atlas 6. They're really fun, like oh my god, fantasy, mystery, like dark academia vibe. I'm just like reading what I wrote in the past. 6 powerful magicians are picked as initiates for a secret society of magical academics. They are very smart, sometimes likable. It took a little bit to draw me in, but once it did, I did not want to put it down. Next we have Dial A for Aunties, which was just like a fun, ridiculous, like silly read. Right at the beginning, the main character like accidentally kills her blind date and calls her mom and her 3 aunts to like help her out. Help her kind of like get rid of the body because she's terrified and doesn't know what to do. Very ridiculous and cheesy, but I loved it. Next is 7 Days in June. This one kind of caught me by surprise. I don't know why I was thinking it would have a different vibe than it did, but it was like kind of a spicy romance. It got steamy, it was delicious, and it included things like chronic illness and complicated family. There was lightness and fun balanced with like heaviness and the reality of the challenges of partnerships and romance and life. I thought it was really well done. Next up we have The Push, which was like a mystery thriller. This one's really hard to explain, I think, without giving any spoilers. Basically, this like mom doesn't feel a connection with her baby, and then as her child grows up, she just thinks her kid is bad. It's really creepy and weird. I didn't love the ending, but overall it was like fun to read. Next on the list is Becoming Abolitionists. This is a great intro into the development of the modern abolitionist movement, and specifically the author Derrica's journey into it. If you're interested in the abolitionist movement and ideology, this is a great read. Next on my list is Cherish Farah, which was a really interesting, creepy, like social horror. It kind of was like Get Out meets My Sister the Serial Killer. Farah is the main character. She's 17. She has like manipulated her way into her best friend's like white adoptive family. The narrator, Farah's perspective, is really unsettling and mysterious, and I did not know how it was gonna end. I really enjoyed this one. Next on the list is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. I've not read a book like this. It's a very interesting like urban fantasy with some sci-fi elements to it. The cast of characters is very diverse, as is pretty typical for N.K. Jemisin. It's very imaginative. It's very interesting. Yeah, I haven't read anything like it. Book 2 I think came out quite recently, so I need to get that and read that one. Next I have Making Love with the Land by Joshua Whitehead. Joshua Whitehead's writing just like blows me away, and this cover is just incredible. Basically, it's a bunch of essays reflecting on, you know, relationships to the land, indigeneity, you know, trauma and pain, and relationships to like language. Joshua just explores so many different things in here, and I just love reading Joshua's thoughts. Next on the list is What the Fireflies Knew, and I think the best way to kind of describe this one is literally a quote from the author about the book. This book was born from a desire to show Black girlhood at its best, at its worst, at its most dull and most exciting. It's beautiful and heartbreaking and so well done. It's a coming-of-age story told from the perspective of KB. She is a 10-year-old girl who just lost her dad, and she has a 14-year-old sister, and it's all about like the summer that she spends at her grandfather's house, who she just recently reconnected with. Okay, we're losing the light. I think I need to like open my window. Okay, lighting. All right, next on the list is Unreconciled. This is like part memoir, part history, like part education. Jesse talks about his family history and residential schools, Indigenous storytelling in media, identity, cultural appropriation, and the truth of reconciliation in Canada, and like so much more. It was a great read. Next on the list is Turn of the Key. It's a very recent read for me. It's a mystery thriller where a nanny gets hired to work in like rural Scotland in this like manor. The last 4 nannies have like ran away pretty quickly because the house is spooky, haunted. It was a fun read. I have mixed feelings about the ending, but overall really good. Next on the list is The Ethical Slut. This is just a really great book about finding freedom in sex and love. It does talk about like polyamory, and there is like a lot of valuable stuff in here outside of that. I'm someone who grew up in purity culture, and I've been like working on freeing myself from the shackles of purity culture and just like finding freedom in sex and love, so a book like this is really helpful. Next I read Ring Shout. It's quite a short book, but it's like a fantasy horror where the KKK become characterized as these like monsters, like physically monsters. You know what I mean? It's really interesting and weird and so interestingly written, and it's a really quick read. It was great. We have reached the 4.5 star tier. These are books I loved, and they were just shy of that 5-star reward. First up, we have Cultish, subtitled The Language of Fanaticism. Basically, it just goes into how language is used in like culty kind of stuff. In the book, she covers like real cults and like religion, MLMs, fitness and wellness culture, Instagram gurus, all sorts of stuff. It was interesting to see kind of like the common threads within language between some of these like culty kind of things. And also I'm just like obsessed with the cover. I think it's amazing. Next up is Disorientation, Being Black in the World. Also another excellent cover design, in my opinion. These are essays that felt really conversational. They flowed really well. I love the writing. And they were really approachable and honest conversations about being Black in the world, and specifically Canada. I thought this was a great read. Next up, I have Detransition Baby. It's definitely like polarizing, very messy, and it had gorgeous writing. I will say some of the characters' like motivations didn't feel like fully fleshed out, but it had really interesting conversations about womanhood, motherhood, queerness, and just like life as a trans woman. But yeah, really fascinating read, messy relationships. It was good. Then I have both of the Sally Rooney books I read this year, Conversations with Friends and Normal People. Very similar books with slight like different plots. I liked Normal People a little bit more than Conversations with Friends. Very like character relational driven and not plot driven. Very messy, very bad communication between both of these books. And usually that like bad communication really grinds my gears, but Sally has such an interesting way of writing it that feels very human. And yeah, I don't know. I enjoy them. I also read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I highly recommend the audiobook version of it. Her story is sad. The way that she was like forced into the film industry and like into her eating disorder and all of these things, it's really like not fun to read and it sucks. But I don't know, the way that she tells it, especially when you listen to the audiobook, I think is really well done, really vulnerable. I thought it was great. Next we have Beach Read by Emily Henry. I kind of touched on this before. I like this one a lot better than People We Meet on Vacation. This is a like comedic romance. The banter, the tension, all of that was really fun. There's a little bit of spice. My favorite romance I read this year for sure. Next I have Crying in H Mart. This has been a big popular read, I would say, over the last year. It was really good. The writing is great. It's Michelle's memoir, largely about her relationship with her mom as she like develops cancer, and the way that their relationship kind of has often revolved around food. There's messiness and humanness and pain here, and it is really beautiful. Then I have A Broken Blade, which is a fantasy romance. Like, this book is fantasy romance at its most like inclusive and diverse and like thoughtful. It had really interesting themes, an excellent slow burn. I actually originally listened to this via audiobook, and then I bought the physical version. The narrator of the audiobook is amazing, really embodied the voice of the book so well. I'm excited for the rest of the series. The romance and the fantasy elements of this book were both excellent. Next up I have Before We Were Trans. I also originally listened to this on audiobook and then I wanted to buy the physical book afterwards. The subtitle is A New History of Gender. This is just a really excellent like historical walkthrough of, you know, the experiences of transgender people across time, across the world, non-binary people, and just like people who challenge the gender binary. I thought this was fantastic. We have made it to the 5-star round. Okay, so first up on the 5-tier level is The Shining. It's almost a 4.5, it's almost a 5, it's a 4.75, but I gave it the 5-star level. It's on the bottom of the 5s, okay? Until I read The Shining, I thought the movie was amazing, and now I need to watch the movie again, but the movie is just not as good. What made the book so much better to me was the like characterization of the Overlook as a character, as like a sentient being, as a villain. It just added so much context, so many new layers to like Jack's spiral. Was very creeped out, really enjoyed it, didn't want to put it down. Next we have White Tears, Brown Scars. How white feminism betrays women of color. It really powerfully and honestly confronts white feminism, specifically how white feminism oppresses women of color. In my opinion, an essential read for like white women who would consider themselves feminist. Next in my 5-star reads is Fevered Star. This is the second book in the Between Earth and Sky series. I am loving this series. It is like a dark and political fantasy series. It's set in like pre-Columbian South America, like South or Central America. The character and world development is really interesting. The characters are dynamic, not always likable, but so interesting to read. And I love that queerness is very normal in this world. As you will see, I love a dark fantasy. I'm starting to lose the light, guys. Okay, next up I have Who is Wellness For? An examination of wellness culture and who it leaves behind. The writing is beautiful and poetic and honest. It's kind of like a memoir style. It's nonfiction, but also kind of journalistic. She examines wellness culture, discusses her experiences with childhood abuse and chronic illness, and being Bangladeshi Muslim. It's an excellent book. Whew, okay. Next, I have The Priory of the Orange Tree. Definitely one of my favorite fantasy reads, and I'm very excited for the next one. I just like want to live in this world longer. There's dragons, there's magic, it's very political, there's sapphic romance, beautiful friendships, rich world building, strong women, great writing. It's a multi-POV, it follows 4 different characters, and I just felt like the character development was really good. Most of the characters have to like face and like reevaluate their beliefs, which I thought was really interesting to read, and I really relate to, so it's fun to see it happen in a fantasy world. Lastly, we have a 3-for-1. I figured it would be easiest just to like list all of them together, the entire Poppy War series. It's just so good. Very like dark, very military and like political focused. It's inspired by like 19th or 20th centuries China and like civil war and war that happened then. Gods like embody people who they call shamans, and they they have the powers of their gods. The characters are hard to love at times. They're really complicated and messy. The relationships are complicated and messy. Like the last book really tied it all together in a way that just felt so right. The series just got like progressively better in my opinion. We made it through all 57 books. High five. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and if you don't, then I just won't do it again. Let me know if you read any of these books, what you thought about them, or any books that you really loved this year that you think I should read. Okay, I should be back with another vlog next week, I think. So see you soon.